Good evening. It's a pleasure to see you all here. I'm Andrew Megill. I'm the associate conductor for the festival and the director of the choral ensembles here. Our amazing professional chorale, 28 singers from across the United States and Canada, and our equally wonderful chorus made up of 44 dedicated and very talented local volunteer singers. And you'll get a chance to hear both of them in tonight's program, which is entitled The Cathedral of Angels. One of the most exciting developments, areas of exploration in music in the last 30 years or so has been the rediscovery of the incredibly rich and exciting musical traditions that were current in Latin America in the colonial period. And that although if you went back probably 30 or 40 years, you would find almost no performances and no recordings and very little historical knowledge of the Latin American Baroque, it's really become a very active area of research and performance. And as you'll hear tonight, for very good reason, because the music is incredibly exciting. The development of music in Latin America is tied obviously very closely to the colonization of the New World, especially by Spanish explorers. And Spain was a dominant area, not only politically, but also musically. There were many, many great Spanish composers of the centuries of the Renaissance, people like Tomás Luis de Victoria and Francisco Guerrero, who wrote some of the most popular and beautiful music of the 16th century. And with the conquistadors and the colonizers coming to the New World, along with, obviously there were many motivations for these people to come and explore new territory, some of which were fairly mercenary, the desire to find gold, some of which were political, but many of them were actually religious. And in fact, this is also the time, for instance, of the great rise of the Jesuits. It always reminds me a little bit of the movie The Mission, for instance. And the Jesuits had a specific and deliberate and explicit mission to evangelize parts of the world that had been under-evangelized in their point of view. And so there were, for instance, many, many men, mostly, a handful of women, mostly men, coming from Spain to the New World to attempt to convert people to Christianity. And one of the things that these Jesuits found was one of the most useful tools was music. And that very quickly it became, and again, a very explicit strategy to bring over fine musicians from Spain and set up singing schools. And in the new churches that were founded here on these Western continents, to have music as it was sung in Western European cathedrals. So for instance, two of the most important composers that are featured on tonight's concert are Juan Padilla and Araujo. Araujo and Padilla were both born in Spain, both emigrated to the New World, and both held positions in major cathedrals in South and Central America. Padilla worked primarily at the cathedral in Puebla, which was known as the Cathedral of Angels. It's where the title of our program comes from. And in fact, the architecture of that building is very spectacular. It's a huge white building. And the musical establishment was equally impressive. That we all, if for instance you were at the concert last night, you would have heard a fantastic piece of music from just before the time of Padilla and Araujo by Claudio Monteverdi, one of the giants of European music. And he worked at the Cathedral of St. Mark's in Venice, which was one of the 4 or 5 most important cathedral positions in Europe. And one of the things I found astonishing is that Padilla at the Puebla Cathedral had a bigger musical establishment than Monteverdi. He had more singers and more instrumentalists. And so the kinds of, they were not rural outposts with scraping together resources. These some of the large cathedrals at least had huge resources available to them compared to other establishments of the time. Araujo worked as the director of music for 3 different cathedrals, ending at the one in Sucre, which is current modern Bolivia, which was also one of the really great centers for music making. So we'll hear tonight a really fascinating mix of music, and one of the things that I find so incredibly appealing about this repertoire is that it takes the familiar forms and genres and techniques of the Western art music that's familiar to us through people like Monteverdi and then evolving through the Baroque to figures like Bach. But there's a unique sort of flavor to them because of the indigenous music that it was mixed with. And I think it's important to remember that although the Western music the European music was brought to the New World by Europeans, that the people who were performing it were most often actually indigenous. And that, for instance, the Araujo in Sucre, the wonderful cathedral that he worked for in Bolivia, he had a huge choir school full of, that taught essentially Aboriginal children. And part of their education was teaching them to sing, much in the same way that Bach was doing in Leipzig about 50 years later and thousands of miles away. So it's fascinating the way these are paralleled. But it's, again, no surprise that because of the performers were largely brought up in a non-European tradition, that there's an incredible influence and mixture of the oral and folk-based tradition of the New World with the really sort of artful and sophisticated music of the European world. And one of the things that always strikes me is that those of you, and this is always an audience that knows a lot about, for instance, the music of Bach, that all of us, I think, are fairly aware that Bach's music was heavily influenced by dances of his time, and that you hear in the Matthew Passion, you hear musical forms based on the saraband or the gigue or the bourrée or the gavotte. And so the dances that were popular in Europe at the time found their way into the music of Bach. And what we find is that the same thing is true with these Latin American composers, but rather than a minuet or a gigue or a gavotte, the dances that influence this music are dances of mostly Afro-Cuban origin. And so there's an incredibly driving rhythmic component and often a sort of a rhythmic complexity that isn't found in European music at this time. And that because I think partly our own popular music, the music of American rock and roll, is rooted in the same Afro-Cuban traditions, there's something that feels both very different and foreign to it, but also very familiar. And that there's an immediacy about this music for many of us that you sort of latch on to the rhythmic drive right away. And one of the just surface details you'll hear throughout all of tonight's concert is an incredible amount of syncopation, much more than you would hear even in very complex composers like Handel. The first piece that we'll hear on tonight's program is a piece called Hanak Pachap Kusikwinen. And you may think that's an unusual title, and indeed it is, because it's not in a language that I've ever sung before except this particular piece. This is, in fact, the first piece of music published in the New World, published in Lima, Peru in around 1631. And it is a processional piece. It says on the manuscript itself that it is meant to be processed to. So it was clearly meant for marching into a cathedral at the beginning of a service. And right off the bat, I think it sets the tone for this particular concert exceedingly well, because this sort of interesting juxtaposition of European and Afro-Cuban / New World is immediately evident in this piece. That the text itself is an invocation to the Virgin Mary, which is not so different than we would expect from virtually any Catholic cathedral in Europe at the same time. But the first tip-off that we're in strange territory is the fact that it's not in Latin. It's in the language of Quechua. And Quechua is, as many of you I'm sure know, is the language that the Incans spoke. As a side note, it's fascinating. We had a young woman here who served an internship with the Bach Festival about 4 years ago named Sylvia Falcon, who was from Colombia, I believe it is. And it turns out her native language is Quechua, which is not so common even in South America, but her father was raised, his first language had been Quechua. So we actually got some nice notes from her about the translation and pronunciation tips. So right off the bat, we have this fascinating juxtaposition of subject matter that seems very European, but in a sound world that is clearly something else. And along with that, you'll also hear that there's an interesting musical juxtaposition of melodies that don't sound too far removed from the European tradition, but with a fascinating harmonic language and rhythmic thrust that doesn't quite feel like any of the European composers that we know and love. Following this first piece, the Hanak Pachap Kusikwinen, the next portion of the program tonight explores liturgical music written for these cathedrals by Padilla and Araujo. And the two pieces that follow Hanak Pachap are both from the service of Vespers, which again is fascinating because I love the way that in a festival this rich and this full of music, the way that there are so many lines that can be drawn from concert to concert. That not only are there connections from piece to piece within this concert, but for instance, any of you that had the pleasure of hearing the concert last night will have heard the chorale and the orchestra play a setting of the psalm Dixit Dominus by Claudio Monteverdi. And in fact, you will have heard a different setting by Monteverdi of this same psalm setting a couple of years ago when we did the Monteverdi Vespers. And this is a psalm setting that was used in a specific service that was extremely popular in Europe. And not surprisingly, it makes its appearance in Catholic cathedrals in South America as well. And so we'll have this same text that Monteverdi set last night, set by Araujo tonight. And you'll also hear some other things that are similar, that all of this liturgical music that we begin this program with is tilted. I've sort of mentioned several times this sort of interesting balance between European and New World influences. This liturgical music is tilted a little bit heavily towards the European influence. And so you'll hear many things that sound very, very much like Monteverdi. Specifically, one of the things that Monteverdi and the city of Venice, musicians from the city of Venice, were known for was the exploration of space. And that they invented something called in Italian cori spezzati, which literally means broken choirs. And don't worry, I haven't done anything to the singers. But it's usually talked about in English as the polychoral tradition, meaning that the singers are divided into various different performing groups that sort of do a call and response back and forth. You may have even noticed this a little bit last night in the Monteverdi Dixit Dominus. There are moments where somebody on the left side of the stage sang and then somebody on the right side of the stage took over. And in St. Mark's Cathedral, these would have been separated by space, and they actually had these large sort of bathtub-like structures in which they put 8 or 10 singers on opposite sides of the room. And so part of the expression was the use of stereophonic space, essentially. And this was one of the features that was new and exciting and really was invented by these Venetian composers. And it's fascinating that this is the style of European music that was popular in Latin America for their sacred music. And so all of this liturgical music will have this kind of quality. The first piece that we'll hear of this liturgical music is a Padilla Deus in Adiutorium Meum, which is the opening versicle from the Vesper service. And it'll be sung, it's set for 2 choirs. And in this case, you'll hear it sung by the chorale divided into 2 separate groups singing down the aisles of the Sunset Center. So you'll have down my left choir 1 and down my right choir 2 singing sort of back and forth to each other and sometimes together. And the sense of space and the sense of three-dimensionality to it is one of the things that makes this music so fascinating. That it's very different than much other music of the time period. And its influence survives quite late. For instance, although the B minor Mass is mostly not in this style, the Hosanna is. That you may have noticed that in the Hosanna, the choir divides into 8 parts instead of 4, and they have a little dialogue back and forth where one side says Hosanna and the other side they'll say Hosanna back. So you'll hear a lot of that sort of back and forth thing going on in these liturgical pieces, and the influence comes from Venice, fascinatingly. After the Dixit Dominus, after the Deus in Adiutorium, then we'll sing the Dixit Dominus, which is the Araujo piece, also for Vespers. The same text that you heard last night. If you're very observant, you may actually hear that the chorale is using a different pronunciation than last night, because we do know that music in the New World, although it was still in Latin, was pronounced in a different way than Latin was pronounced in Europe. And so the title of the piece last night was Dixit Dominus. The title of the piece tonight is Dixit Dominus. So if you're interested, you might even listen for how the sounds of and what's fascinating is that the sounds of the language, although they're still in Latin, they begin to sound very much like Spanish. And in the Dixit Dominus of Juan de Araujo, we actually divide the choir into 3 choirs. The first choir is made up of just 3 singers and 2 instrumentalists, and they'll sing from sort of the highest point on the stage. And then choir 2 will be on your left, and choir 3 will be on your right. And Araujo, like most of these composers influenced by Venice, encouraged conductors and choirs to use instruments, but didn't tell anybody specifically how. And so he said, use some instruments to play along with the 2 choirs. So one of the things you'll hear tonight is what instruments we've chosen. We'll accompany choir 1 with a string band, and we'll accompany choir 2 with sackbuts, which are an early form of trombone. And so you'll have 2 very different colors. And you'll hear also the sort of the play with space and the play with size and texture that's such a part of this style. That it starts with just sort of 3 tiny, sort of slightly lonely voices, and then periodically you get the world bursting in from every corner is sort of how it feels. Following these pieces from Vespers, we'll explore another side of liturgical music, which is settings of the Mass. And so what we're doing in this portion of the program is we're going to perform the Kyrie and Gloria of a Mass by Padilla, a Mass called Missa Ego Flos Campi, and it's again very much in the Venetian polychoral style. And because we're a Bach festival, we have found interesting to contrast this Kyrie and Gloria by Padilla from the middle part of the Baroque with the Kyrie and Gloria by Bach from the late part of the Baroque, and hear how radically different they sound. And so you'll get to hear the same settings of text by a New World composer and then by our favorite Old World composer. I hope it's true for all of us here at the Carmel Bach Festival that he reigns supreme. But I think you'll find that fascinating. It also, I think, makes, again, a fascinating line to the B minor Mass on Saturday. That most people, even quite educated music lovers, don't realize that Bach wrote more than one Mass. That the B minor Mass is sort of, because it is one of the 2 or 3 most beautiful settings of the Mass in music history, there are 4 other small Mass settings that have been a little bit overshadowed by that. They don't set the entire Mass text, they only set the Kyrie and Gloria, for the reason that Bach, in his Lutheran church, couldn't use the rest of the piece liturgically. And so the B minor Mass was never performed in Bach's lifetime, and he probably never expected to be performed ever, because it wasn't usable liturgically in his own tradition. He wrote the Kyrie and Gloria first as a separate piece that was usable, and then he added the rest seemingly for himself and for God, because there was a long tradition of Masses, and he sort of wanted to be part of his forebears in a way. But he did write 4 other small Masses called Missa Brevis, including the G minor Mass, which we'll hear today, which is a fantastic piece, should be performed a lot, and is almost never performed. It's, as you all probably know, the text of the Gloria from the Mass is extremely jubilant, and one of my favorite comments from one of the chorale members was that they'd never heard a Gloria that was quite so fierce. And I think that's a great way to describe it. It's interesting, several of us also had the same idea. There's no evidence for this whatsoever, but several of us wondered if this Mass, the Masses that Bach set, these small Masses, were used for the highest feast days of the year. And several of us sort of independently wondered. Again, there's no evidence, so don't quote this as truth. But several of us wondered if this was perhaps written specifically for Pentecost, because it has such a feel of sort of flames of fire and wind. It has this sort of rushing quality that's really quite exciting. Following the Bach Mass, the next big piece on the program is the Lamentations of Jeremiah by Alberto Ginastera. And this again allows us to do a piece of Latin liturgical music from Latin America, but in this case written in the 20th century. That this is, for me, probably the masterpiece of 20th century Latin American choral music. It's an a cappella setting in 3 movements, very virtuosic, extremely difficult to sing, but extremely powerful. Settings of the heart-rending words of Jeremiah from the Book of Lamentations from the Bible, which he wrote after the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of the Jewish people. And it's full of rage and despair at having been abandoned by God, but does find its way back to hopefulness at the end. And it's a spectacular piece and allows us again to sort of see, in some ways, some through lines back to earlier Latin American music, and to sort of be another flavor in this sort of wonderful smorgasbord of musical styles that you get to experience tonight. Following the Ginastera, we'll close the program with 4 works that are, about 15 minutes ago I mentioned that these liturgical music pieces tend to be dominated by European influences. The last pieces we'll sing for you, the 4 villancicos, are pieces that are dominated by New World influences. So if you're interested in the Afro-Cuban dance influence, this is where to look. And they're fascinating and beautiful pieces, starting to become extremely popular, starting to get more and more recordings and performances, and when you hear them, you'll understand why. They're incredibly immediate, incredibly exciting, incredibly expressive. All of them are, although they're written by the same composers. For instance, we'll end with a piece that may have been written by Araujo, the same composer who wrote the Dixit Dominus. They come from a very different sound world, that the influences are much less, at least at first glance, sophisticated and artful, and more rooted in folk traditions. And so you'll hear fascinating use of percussion. You'll hear an incredibly driving rhythm through most of them. They're all in exceedingly simple forms, the form of almost all popular music, which is verse, refrain, verse, refrain, verse, refrain. So you'll hear that in all these villancicos. The first one is called Convidando Esta la Noche, I love the names of these composers, they're just fun to say. His name is Juan Garcia de Espadas. And it's the refrain of this particular composer, of this particular villancico, is, I am lit with divine fire, I am burning with love for God. But in between every sentence or half sentence, the singers are so overcome by ecstasy, they stop and they say, I. And so you get, I, que me abrazo, I get it, I this, and I that. And it has this wonderful sort of fragmented, energetic effect. The second of the villancicos is called Ay Galeguinos by Menem Jimenez. And Ay Galeguinos has the same I that crops up over and over again, but this time it's gentler and still conveys the idea of sort of being so overcome by emotion that you can't finish a sentence. But in this case, it's a group of Galicians who were seafaring people from essentially Portugal. And so it's the conceit of this is that they've traveled the world, these people that know how ships work, and so maybe they were able to get to the Holy Land and see Jesus born. And so it's about Galician sailors landing in Bethlehem, which is fascinating to begin with, and finding the baby Jesus and saying, "Ay, he's so small. Ay, he's so beautiful." The third villancico is called Asiolo Flasiquillo by Padilla. It's a fantastic piece. I always have a small amount of trepidation in programming it because of the text. There was a group of villancicos called negrias, and they are meant to mimic the speech patterns of the African slaves when they spoke Spanish. And so, in fact, what's written out is, it would be a little bit like someone writing out the pidgin dialect of Cajuns, that they write out the phonetic sounds of what they're saying. And I think it's a very fine line between when this is making fun of someone and when it's in a way acknowledging their culture. And to be completely honest, I go back and forth about which one this piece is. I find this piece so exciting and so beautiful that I've continued to perform it a few times. But I will share with you that I'm always concerned that someone will take it the wrong way, and as an attempt to belittle and sort of minimize the intelligence or humanity of the African slaves. And so in some ways I just think it's fairest and most adult to put that out on the table and that you all digest that as you will. I find that in the end I don't feel that it's condescending. I feel that it's life-affirming, but it certainly does have a slightly cartoonish aspect to it that creates a little bit of discomfort every time I look at it. So tell me what you think afterwards. I think it's worth doing, but I also think it's worth acknowledging the inherent difficulties. It's a struggle we have with any historical art form, isn't it? You know, we sort of, how do we deal with the beauty that's there and also the fact that history is not as clean as we would like. And then the final villancico we'll do is one that's new to me, but one I'm really excited about. It's called Salga el Torrio Osquillo. It's attributed to two different composers in two different manuscripts. It's either by a man named Diego José de Salazar or by Araujo again. And in fact, one of the difficulties is that it appears in two manuscripts, one in Spain and one in Bolivia. And so it was written in one of those places and was popular enough to cross the ocean the other direction. Most scholars think it was probably written in Spain and then became extremely popular in the New World, but it could have been the other way around. And it tells the story of the Christian redemption story, but it tells it with the metaphor of a bullfight. And so it talks about the boy matador, who is the baby Jesus, coming with his sword to slay the devil, the bull. And the choir sings, their words are all sort of the cries of a crowd at a bullfight, overcome by fear at the fiendishness of the bull. And they keep sort of urging the fight forward and saying, oh no, he's coming towards me. And it's fascinating, this sort of really energetic, wild back and forthing. And not surprisingly, that this composer, whoever he was, dipped back into the bag of tricks we opened the whole concert with, which is this idea of two choirs calling back and forth to each other to create this crowd scene. And so the choir, again, is divided into two separate ensembles which sort of call back and forth, let the bull go now, no, don't. And it's a fascinating and very high-energy piece. And that'll be the final piece in the program. The last thing I'll say before we have time for a couple of questions is that we're we're trying something new in this program as well that I'm really excited about and hope that you'll enjoy. And that's that those of you that have been part of the Bach Festival will know that for many years we've had this fantastic set of super titles that David Gordon arranges for us. And we've decided this year to experiment with adding to those super titles. For this particular program, we wanted to, it partly came from, again, the history of the Wednesday night concerts. So again, those of you that are longtime Carmel Bach fans will know that traditionally the Wednesday night program has been in the Mission. And this year there's some construction that was scheduled to have gone on at the Mission that meant we weren't sure if we'd be able to be there. So we're here at Sunset, which has some wonderful things to it. The sound is cleaner and easier to sing in, and you'll have more comfortable seats. It'll be easier to hear the sound here than it is in the Mission. But we all do recognize that there is something extremely special about the ambiance of the Mission. And while we're not going to try to recreate that, because I don't think that would be possible and I think it would only be foolish, we did want to in some way set the Wednesday night program apart from the other programs at Sunset. And so what you'll find is that for each one of these pieces, in addition to the super titles, we'll be projecting art that is related in some way to the time period and the place and the texts. And so, for instance, during the opening procession, the Hanak Pachap, we found this fantastic Peruvian icon of the Virgin Mary from the time period in which the music was written. And for those of you that prefer not to, you can shut your eyes and just listen. For those that are interested, it's sort of above the stage and you can sort of see the pictures as they go by. We've tried to find a balance where there aren't so many that it distracts you from listening at all. But our hope is that one of the great joys of being in the Mission is that the beauty of that physical space often, I think, helps audiences to feel connected to the music and to create a different sort of relationship between listener and performer, that it feels less like we're performing for you and more that we're sort of going through an experience together. And we're hoping that in a way that is very different, because I don't think it's possible to recreate the Mission atmosphere upstairs, that we can create some of the same effect to allow all of you to feel as engaged in this performance as if we were in a smaller, more intimate space, by allowing you sort of several different avenues of entry into this. Later examples, for instance, are we have 3 beautiful paintings of Jeremiah for the 3 movements of the Lamentations of Jeremiah. We have a fantastic Goya bullfight for the Salga at the end. So, so invite you to sort of have a feast for the eyes as well as the ears. And if you're interested, at the very end of the program, the super titles will tell you the list of all the sources. Oh, one of the things I find fascinating is earlier in the program I mentioned we have the contrast between the Padilla Mass and the Bach Mass. What we've chosen to do there is we're going to show you projections of the architecture of the 2 buildings for which those were written. So you can see the ceiling of the Puebla Cathedral and the ceiling of the Leipzig Thomaskirche. And I think it is fascinating to sort of see similarities and differences throughout. So in 2 minutes, I'm supposed to go up and start warming up the chorale, but that means that I've got 2 minutes to answer any questions that have leapt to your mind. So if anybody has any, yes, please. Villancico means it's a musical form that is a verse and refrain, often about Christmas, but not always. That's specifically Spanish from the late Renaissance and Baroque, and there are in fact thousands of them. And they were extremely popular. They were sort of the pop music of their day, and they've just begun to be performed in modern world again. And we all know, if we know a lot of them, we now know 300 or 400 of them. But there are thousands of them nobody has explored yet. So keep looking for it. You'll see more and more of them over the next 20 or 30 years, I'm sure. So, anything else, please?
As the director tonight, what has been your greatest challenge in putting this program together?
2 things. One of the challenges always at the Bach Fest was just the sheer amount of music we have to put together in such a short amount of time. This is our 4th program of 5. And so to some extent, it's the exhaustion factor. That, by the time you put up 3 programs, you're ready for a break. And so this is fantastic music, and I don't think you get a hint of exhaustion from the singers tonight. But there are days when we think, we've been working a lot of days in a row. So that's nothing to do with the music, but it's part of the structure, and it's both the joy of this place and the difficulty for us. I'd say the other thing that's slightly tricky is because so much of this music was designed to be used with spatial separation, this Venetian style, that's a little tricky to do in Sunset. And we've tried to find ways to do it, but it makes it slightly dangerous in a way that would be less dangerous in St. Mark's to split. You hear each other across a little more easily. There will be times tonight when we're really having to be careful because we're singing from long spun distances, which is, it's also exciting. It's a little bit, I suppose, I've never done it, but I suppose it's like walking a tightrope. But there's a certain adrenal thrill from that's wonderful. But at the same time, there's also, there's quite a fall if you miss.